Hello, and welcome back to Accidental Transcendental. I'm Paul, and today I want to talk about one of the strangest patterns I keep noticing in growth, healing, creativity, parenting, relationships, and generally trying to live as a semi-functional human being in a world that does not appear to have come with clear instructions. It is that moment when you think you finally understood something, finally learned the lesson, finally made the change, finally stepped into the slightly wiser, calmer, more integrated version of yourself. And then, 2 days later, you're standing in the kitchen at midnight, mindlessly chomping your way through a share bag of crisps, wondering whether you've actually learned anything in your entire life. Hypothetically, obviously. Because growth is strange like that. You have a breakthrough. You feel clearer, lighter, more open, more yourself. You make the decision, have the conversation, set the boundary, start the project, feel the possibility. And for a while, it really does feel like something has shifted. Like the world has got a little bigger. Like you've stepped into a wider room. And then something contracts. The doubt comes back. The tiredness comes back. The resistance comes back. The old pattern wanders back in, wearing a slightly different hat and pretending it wasn't invited. And it's very easy in that moment to think, oh, I've gone backwards. And I'm not sure that's always true. I'm not sure growth feels like a straight line because I'm not sure growth is a straight line. At least it hasn't been my experience. In my experience, meaningful change seems to move much more like a wave. Expansion, contraction, integration, and underneath all of that, capacity. What can actually be held right now? That question has become increasingly important to me because it's very easy to look around at other people's edited lives and decide we are doing something wrong. Someone else appears to be parenting better, creating better, healing faster, building the business, writing the book, taking the beautiful family holiday, living the dream, and somehow doing it all in nice lighting. But most of what we see is compressed, edited, angled towards comfort and away from the mess. I won't flip my camera here as a noble act of proving a point, but I'm sure you can picture the scene. All too often, we see the success, not the day they nearly quit. The smiling photos, not the tears beforehand. One perfect family moment, not the harsh words in the car park 20 minutes earlier. And when we compare our unedited inner weather with someone else's polished highlight reel, we can start expecting ourselves to move in ways that no real living system actually moves. Always expanding, always improving, always becoming, always ready for the next brave step. But real life is messier than that. Real bodies get tired. Real nervous systems reach capacity. Real families have rhythms. Real projects wobble. Real growth loops back on itself. So if the last episode was about the boxes we build around ourselves, this episode is about what happens when the box starts opening. Because opening is beautiful, but it is not always comfortable. More space means more possibility, but it can also mean more uncertainty, more honesty, more exposure, more life trying to move in at once. So today, I want to explore this wave. Not as a set of rules, not as a grand theory, not as here is how you improve your life in 10 easy steps. Because firstly, I don't have 10 easy steps. And secondly, I would be suspicious of anyone who did. More as field notes, things I've noticed, patterns that have helped me be a little kinder to myself when life opens, closes, pauses, and opens again. Maybe some of them will be useful to you. Maybe some won't. The walk is yours. The wave is yours. But perhaps there is something helpful in the idea that every dip is not automatically failure. Every contraction is not collapse. Every pause is not proof that the expansion was fake. Maybe some of it is rhythm. Maybe some of it is pacing. Maybe some of it is the system asking, Can we hold this? Can we live this? What needs to become steadier before this can become real? So let's begin with expansion, the moment the world gets bigger. And I want to keep this fairly ordinary to start with, because expansion can sound like a very grand word, like it should involve mountains, or chanting, or standing barefoot in a field while the universe sends you a very personalised lighting cue. And sometimes, maybe, it does feel dramatic. Sometimes expansion is a genuine breakthrough, a spiritual experience, a creative flood, a relationship opening. A moment where something about your life suddenly reorganizes itself around a truth you can no longer unsee. But most expansion, in my experience, is quieter than that, more ordinary, more easily missed. Sometimes it is a conversation that opens a door, a book that gives new language to something you have felt for years, a new idea that makes an old pattern look different, a small act of honesty, a boundary you finally realize you are allowed to have. Sometimes it is just the moment where life feels slightly less impossible than it did yesterday. And that counts. It does not have to look impressive to be real. I think that matters because we often expect growth to announce itself dramatically. We expect transformation to arrive with a soundtrack. But sometimes expansion looks like sending an email, or tidying one corner of the room, or telling the truth slightly sooner than usual, or noticing that the old story does not quite fit as tightly as it used to. Something opens. Not everything, not forever, just something. The map gains another road. The room gains another door. The self gains another possible shape. And of course, that can feel wonderful. There is a reason why we chase expansion. Clarity feels good. Inspiration feels good. Connection feels good. The moment when something clicks into place can feel almost electric. Suddenly, the thing that was foggy becomes obvious. The thing that felt impossible becomes imaginable. The version of yourself that seemed theoretical starts waving from somewhere just ahead of you. And there is a very human temptation in that moment to think, there, that's it, I've got it now. Which is a beautiful sentence, and a dangerous one. Because expansion has a persuasive energy. It shows you the larger room and says, look, we could live here. And maybe you can. Maybe the glimpse is real. Maybe the wider life is genuinely available. But seeing the room is not the same as living in it. Opening the door is not the same as moving in. And buying the guitar is not the same as becoming the sort of person who calmly practices scales every evening whilst radiating disciplined artistic maturity. Apparently. This is where expansion can become a little tricky. Because sometimes the opening is so exciting that we immediately start building a whole identity around it. We buy the thing, download the app, order the books, watch 17 tutorials, announce the new era, create the folder, create a backup folder, possibly a spreadsheet with tabs and color coding. And for a while, it feels wonderful, alive, possible, full of momentum. But what expansion gives us is not always a finished path. Sometimes it gives us a glimpse, a doorway, an invitation, the next resonant edge. Something close enough to recognize, but new enough to grow us. Like you, but not quite you yet. And I think that phrase matters, the next resonant edge. Because expansion does not always ask us to leap completely into the unknown. Often the healthier movement is more gradual. One familiar thing reaching towards another. Reading becomes thinking. Thinking becomes writing. Writing becomes audio. Audio becomes video. A point-and-click interest in photography becomes, at the right time, learning the manual settings, then composition, then editing, then discovering that the image you captured has another layer of life hidden inside it. Not because you forced yourself into a totally foreign shape overnight, but because one thing quietly led to the next, breadcrumb by breadcrumb. That kind of expansion can be beautiful. It has a friendliness to it, a sense of adventure without quite becoming a dare. But even friendly expansion is still expansion, and expansion always changes the system. A bigger world is not only more exciting, it contains more information, more choice, more responsibility, more uncertainty, more exposure. And the body notices that. The nervous system notices that. The life you already have notices that. Because the question is not only, is this good? It is also, can we hold this? What changes if this becomes real? What else has to move? What might this cost? We assume that because something is good, inspiring, exciting, or true, it should automatically feel easy to receive. But it doesn't always work like that. Even positive change can be tiring. Even good news can be overwhelming. Even a dream become impossible can make you want to lie down in a dark room and reconsider having dreams. Because something has opened, and that is beautiful. But now the whole system has to reorganize around the fact the door is open. That this is where the next part of the wave begins. Because after expansion, very often comes contraction. Not because the expansion was wrong, not because the door was closed, not because you failed, but because some part of the system says, hold on, before we go any further, can we check the foundations? So yes, after expansion comes contraction. Not because the breakthrough was fake, not because you've failed some invisible spiritual exam administered by the universe for reasons best known to middle management. Just because something opened. And now the system is responding. That is the part I found myself slowly learning not to panic about. Not always successfully, but slowly. Because from the inside, contraction rarely feels wise. It does not usually arrive wearing a badge that says, don't worry, this is a necessary recalibration phase. It usually feels like tiredness, aching, doubt, irritation, resistance. A sudden desire to cancel everything and return to a smaller, more familiar version of life. Yesterday you were clear, you were inspired, you were absolutely, definitely stepping into a new era of calm, aligned, sustainable growth. And then today arrives, and your confidence has wandered off. Your body feels heavy. Your brain has opened 24 tabs, and none of them are responding. Your brave new life appears to involve admin. And the old familiar voice appears. See? Told you. Nothing really changed. But what if something did change? What if this is partly why the contraction arrived? What if contraction is not always the absence of growth, but the consequence of growth meeting a real nervous system? Because every expansion introduces new information, a new possibility, a new demand, a new honesty, a new version of life that might now be available. And some part of us has to ask, can we hold this? Can we live this? Can we recover from this? Can we stay safe if this becomes real? That question can look a lot like resistance. It can sound like doubt. It can feel like regression. But sometimes it is intelligence. Maybe not glamorous intelligence. Maybe not the kind you put on a vision board, but intelligence all the same. Contraction often draws us back towards the known, the familiar, the smaller room, the old routine, the comfort watch, the safe meal, the thing we already understand well enough to walk through on autopilot. And sometimes, yes, that can become avoidance. Of course it can. Sometimes I do hide. Sometimes I do retreat. Sometimes I use the phrase, I'm just integrating, as a very elegant way of not replying to an email. Again, hypothetically. But I think there is a difference between avoiding the wave and giving the system time to metabolize it. That difference is not always obvious, which is inconvenient. It would be helpful if the body sent clearer notifications. Hello, Paul. This is healthy recovery. Please proceed with kindness. Or, this is fear in a cardigan pretending to be wisdom. Please take one small step. But it rarely works like that. Most of the time, we have to feel our way through, messily, imperfectly, with the information we have. And this is where I think I used to get into trouble. I treated contraction as proof that something had gone wrong. If I got tired after an expansion, I assumed I'd overreached. If I doubted the project, I assumed the inspiration had gone. If something felt harder than expected, I assumed I wasn't built for it. And sometimes, maybe, there was truth in that. Sometimes we do overreach. Sometimes we do need to stop. Sometimes the thing is just not ours. Sometimes the door opened, simply so we could see what was on the other side, not permanently move in. But not always. Sometimes contraction is simply growth asking for a chair and a glass of water. It is the system saying, can we slow this down? Can we make this safer? Can we break this into smaller steps? Can we stop pretending excitement automatically creates capacity? That last one has been particularly rude in my own life. Because excitement can make everything feel possible. The new project, the new rhythm, the new creative direction, the new version of yourself who apparently has unlimited focus, energy, discipline, confidence, and a suspiciously clean desk. And then contraction arrives with a clipboard and says, lovely vision, where exactly were you planning to put this? That is not always sabotage. Sometimes it's a foundation check. And I've found that when we meet contraction with curiosity, rather than immediate self-accusation, something softens. Not magically, not every time, but enough to notice. Instead of only asking, what is wrong with me? I can sometimes ask, what opened? What felt too much? What is this trying to protect? What needs to become smaller, slower, and more familiar before it can become real? Those questions do not remove the discomfort, but they change my relationship with it. They give contraction a place in the conversation, not the final say, not the steering wheel, but a place. Because I don't want fear to run my life, but I also don't want to bulldoze every signal that feels inconvenient. That for me is the delicate middle path. Not worshipping contraction, not shaming it, listening for the information inside it. And that brings us to the word sitting underneath this whole episode, capacity. Because if expansion opens the door and contraction checks the foundations, then capacity asks the most practical question of all. What can actually be held right now? And I think this matters enormously, because capacity is one of those words that sounds very sensible, very grown up, very likely to appear in a meeting where somebody has brought a laminated handout. But underneath that slightly beige exterior, I think it might be one of the most compassionate ideas I've found. Because capacity is not a fixed identity. It's not a life sentence. It's not the final measurement of who you are. Capacity is simply the honest shape of what your system can hold in this moment. Your body, your mind, your nervous system, your relationship, your resources, your season of life. All of it. And that means capacity is real. It deserves respect. But it is also dynamic. It can change. Sometimes it expands. Sometimes it shrinks. Sometimes it disappears completely because someone has moved your keys. The washing machine is making a concerning noise. And there is a school email that begins with the words, just a reminder. Hypothetically again. But the important point is this. Your current capacity is not a permanent ceiling. It may be true. It may be very true. It may need to be honoured with absolute sincerity. But that does not mean it is the final truth of your life. And I think this is where many of us can get caught, especially if we've spent years being misunderstood, years being pushed beyond our limits, years being told we should cope better, try harder, be less sensitive, be more resilient, be more normal. When you finally find language for your limits, that can be profoundly healing. It can be a relief, a necessary correction, a way of saying, no, this actually costs me more than it costs you. And that matters, deeply. But there is also a subtle trap here. Because sometimes the language that helps us stop blaming ourselves can slowly become the language that stops us imagining movement. This is my lens. These are my needs. This is my identity. This is what I can and can't do. This is me. And sometimes, yes, that may be exactly the truth that needed to be named. But sometimes, if we are not careful, we accidentally turn a current capacity into a permanent boundary. We take a snapshot and mistake it for the whole film. And that is not a criticism. I understand why we do it. When the world has pushed us too hard, naming a limit can feel like finally being allowed to breathe. But after the breathing space comes another question. Not immediately, not aggressively, not with someone standing over your shoulder shouting, "Have you tried growing?" Please don't be that person. But gently, eventually, curiously. Is this still my edge? Or is this where my edge used to be? That question has become very useful to me because capacity is not a verdict. It is more like a weather report. It tells you what conditions are present, what can be held, what needs shelter, what might be possible today, what should probably wait until the storm has passed. And just like weather, it changes. Not always on command, not always conveniently. Not because you've written increase capacity in a notebook and underlined it twice. But it changes, especially when we stop wasting so much energy fighting ourselves, when we reduce friction, when we create rhythms that actually fit, when we build familiarity, when we practice small steps, when we recover properly, when we give the system evidence that the wider world can be entered safely. This is why I like the idea of tending capacity rather than forcing it. Capacity is less like kicking down a door and more like doing up a home. You don't usually start with the extension. You start with what can be held. One wall, one room, one small repair that makes the next small repair easier. You paint the walls, personalize a room, put up shelves, clear a corner. Fix something that has been quietly annoying you for 3 years, but has somehow become part of the furniture emotionally. And then, over time, the house begins to hold more life. Maybe one day you build another bedroom. Maybe you add a conservatory. Maybe you renovate the kitchen. Maybe you buy a nicer car because the whole system around you has become steadier. Not because everything changed in one heroic leap, but because capacity was tended, built, supported, expanded through manageable experience. The same thing happens with life. And I've seen this so clearly with family holidays. At one stage, especially when our children were very young, even leaving the house could feel like an expedition, requiring planning, courage, snacks, backup snacks, emotional resilience, and at least 3 forms of weather-based contingency. Slowly, the kids got a bit older, became a little bit more capable themselves. Then COVID arrived and the world became smaller again. Not theoretically smaller, actually smaller, physically smaller, socially smaller, energetically smaller. And then gradually, life began opening again. Not all at once. Not straight to airport lounges and confident international travel. Small trips, close to home, familiar places, manageable distances, a little more range, a little more confidence, a little more evidence. Then longer days out, then further trips away. Now the possibility of travelling abroad one day soon feels less like an impossible fantasy and more like the next edge. Still big, still requiring planning, still with plenty of room for chaos, because children. But not unthinkable anymore. That, to me, is capacity changing. Not through force, through rhythm, recovery, evidence. Small experiences that become part of the system. And none of those stages are more morally impressive than the others. That feels important. The local trip is not a lesser life than the foreign holiday. The shelf is not a failed extension. The first small step is not embarrassing because somebody else is already running. They are simply different capacities, different seasons, different rooms in the same unfolding life. The danger comes when we compare our current capacity to somebody else's current capacity, or even to our own capacity from a completely different season. And then use comparison as a weapon. Because there will always be someone doing more. Someone travelling further, creating faster, parenting more gracefully, living the dream more photogenically. Apparently living in a version of life that would currently flatten you by Tuesday. But we must recognize that we are usually seeing the edited version, the compressed version, the polished angle. We see the result, not the recovery, the smile, not the argument, the finish room, not the months of dust, delays, overspending, and quietly regretting every decision that led to owning a spirit level. And if we compare our full messy process to somebody else's finished looking moment, we are not comparing like for like. So yes, for me, capacity has become a kinder word, a more honest word, not an excuse, not a cage, not a box with softer wallpaper. A starting point, a way of asking, what can be held now? And what might become possible if I tend this wisely? Because if we skip capacity, we tend to do one of two things. We either force ourselves beyond our limits, or we mistake our limits for identity. But if we listen to capacity with a little more honesty, we begin to learn the true art of growth. Not staying the same, not pushing through, not collapsing into the old shape, but building enough steadiness that life can become safely larger. One shelf, one room, one rhythm, one honest step at a time. And that brings us to integration. Because seeing a larger life is one thing, having enough capacity to hold it is another. But eventually, if the wave is going to become real, something has to be built. And that, I think, is integration. Integration is the part of growth that often looks the least impressive from the outside. It is not always dramatic. It is not always emotional. It is not always accompanied by thunder, synchronicity, or an orchestral soundtrack. Which is disappointing. I would enjoy more orchestral confirmation in daily life. But integration is where change becomes livable. Expansion shows you something. Contraction checks the foundations. Capacity asks what can actually be held. And integration says, right, how does this become part of ordinary life? Because this is where everything eventually has to land. Ordinary life. The place with laundry, emails, school runs, work meetings, food shopping, unexpected bills, family moods, low batteries. And at least one small household task that has been waiting so long it has started to feel historically significant. This is another place I used to get a little confused. I thought the powerful moment was the change. The insight, the breakthrough, the emotional release, the sudden clarity, the moment where everything glowed for a while and I thought, there, that's it. I understand it now. And those moments matter. They really do. Sometimes they open a door that badly needed opening. But they are not the whole movement. They are not the room. They are just the glimpse. Integration is what happens afterwards, when the glow fades a little, when the emails come back, where someone asks where their shoes are in a tone that suggests you have personally hidden them as part of a long-term psychological experiment. That's where the work lives. Not the glamorous work necessarily. Not the kind of work that anyone is likely to make a dramatic film about. Although, I would watch a very serious documentary about one man establishing a sustainable bedtime routine. But the real work, the ordinary work, the work of letting the insight become part of how you actually live. Less I have seen the truth, more I paused before reacting. Maybe not my entire life has changed. More closer to, I said no slightly sooner. Maybe not now I'm a completely different person, but more I noticed the pattern before it ate the whole afternoon. And I think that's very easy to underestimate. Because integration often feels quieter than expansion. Less sparkly, less charged, less obviously meaningful. Expansion has lightning. Integration has wiring. And I love that image. Because lightning is spectacular, but wiring is what lets you turn the lights on every day. Integration is the movement from peak to practice, from glimpse to rhythm, from insight to relationship, from possibility to structure. Not dead structure, not another box, not a rigid plan that slowly becomes a punishment. Living structure, the kind that supports movement instead of trapping it. And I think that matters because it is possible to chase expansion whilst avoiding integration. I've definitely done that. The next insight, the next model, the next book, the next idea, the next exciting possibility. The next thing that makes me feel, briefly, like I am finally becoming the version of myself that I was apparently supposed to become several decades ago. But if none of it enters ordinary life, if none of it changes the shape of a day, if none of it alters how I rest, speak, choose, recover, parent, create, or respond, then it remains strangely weightless. Beautiful, maybe. True, maybe. But not yet lived. And that has been a humbling thing to learn. Because I like the big ideas. I like the shimmer. I like the sense of everything connecting. Of course I do. I have built an entire podcast around noticing strange patterns and then talking about them into a microphone. But integration keeps asking a much less glamorous question. What changes now? Not in theory, not in the imagined future, not in a version of life where everyone is well rested and the house is tidy and no one has asked me to locate a missing shoe. Here, now, in this life, at this capacity. What changes by 1 degree? And often the answer is surprisingly small. Move the thing, send the message, take the rest, lower the expectation, make the next step easier, practice the awkward sentence, leave space after the demanding thing. Stop treating every new idea like it needs to become a new identity by Thursday. Small, ordinary adjustments. Almost disappointingly practical. But maybe that is how real change becomes stable. Not through one dramatic leap, but through repeated contact. Through the system slowly learning, oh, we live like this now. And this is why integration can feel like losing the magic. The lightning becomes wiring. The revelation becomes rhythm. The expansion becomes a shelf, a routine, a boundary, a slightly kinder response, a bit of space in the calendar. And from one angle, that can look like the glow fading. But from another angle, it is the glow learning how to stay. Not as fireworks, as warmth. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is more useful. Because a life cannot run on constant fireworks. At some point, someone has to make tea. So for me, integration is not the quiet bit after growth. It is the part that makes growth real. The wave rises, the wave falls. But integration is where the shore is changed. And once we understand that, we can see the mistake that many of us make. We stop treating the cycle as a cycle and start treating every dip in the wave as a personal failure. And I say we very comfortably here, because I have absolutely done this. Many times, with enthusiasm. I have had the breakthrough, felt the clarity, seen the pattern, written the notes, made the plan, announced at least internally that a new era had begun. And then a harder day arrives, a slower day, a doubtful day, a day where the same life that felt full of possibility yesterday now appears to contain far too many objects, noises, people, expectations, and emails. And suddenly the story changes. I'm back where I started. I've lost it. I knew it wouldn't last. That version of me wasn't real. But I'm increasingly suspicious of that story, because I don't think the wave has failed just because it has moved. I don't think the tide has betrayed the shore by going out. That sounds obvious when we talk about nature. No one stands on a beach at low tide and says, well, the ocean has clearly given up. Nobody watches winter arrive and says, apparently the trees were only pretending to grow. We understand cycles everywhere else. But when they happen inside of us, we panic. Or at least I do. I like to keep my accusations honest. And I think part of the problem is that so much of modern life trains us to expect straight lines. Progress, improvement, growth, productivity, milestones, output, visible success. We want the graph to go up. Preferably smoothly, without unexplained dips. Preferably in a way that can be summarized attractively if anyone asks how we're doing. But real lives are rarely that tidy. Real families, real creative work, real healing are not that tidy. Real nervous systems most certainly are not that tidy. And yet, when we compare ourselves to other people, we often compare our full messy weather to their edited forecast. We see the success, not the wobble. The confident post, not the morning they nearly deleted the whole thing. We see the parent who looks like they know what they're doing, not the one quietly wondering in the kitchen whether they have permanently ruined everyone by using the wrong tone at 7:43. Again, hypothetically. And I think the edited mirror does something to us. It tilts us away from truth and towards comfort. Not real comfort, image comfort, performance comfort. The kind that says, look, everything is fine. Look, I'm doing well. Look, I'm keeping up. But if we are always looking at edited lives and then expecting our unedited lives to match them, we can start misreading ordinary cycles as evidence against ourselves. A tired day becomes proof that we are failing. A messy week becomes proof that we lack discipline. A contraction becomes proof we were foolish to believe in the expansion. And maybe that is why the wave can feel so punishing. Not because the wave itself is cruel, but because we keep telling a cruel story about it. We expect ourselves to expand without returning, to grow without resting, to understand without digesting, to change without reorganizing. And then we judge ourselves when the system does exactly what living systems do. It pulses, it breathes, it opens, it closes, it takes in, it processes, it releases. That is not failure, that is rhythm. The problem is not that we move in cycles. The problem is that we expect a cyclical system to behave like a straight line. And I think that expectation creates a lot of unnecessary suffering. Because if you believe growth should be linear, then every contraction looks like evidence against you. Every tired day becomes a verdict. Every pause becomes a prosecution. Every need for rest becomes proof that you are falling behind. But if you understand the wave, or even just begin to suspect its existence, then those same experiences can start becoming information instead. Not verdicts, information. Tiredness may be information. Resistance may be information. Avoidance, excitement, overwhelm, even boredom may all be information. Annoying information, perhaps, but information all the same. And for me, that shift has been quietly important. Not because it solves everything. It does not. I remain very capable of overreacting to ordinary human weather. But it gives me a slightly kinder place to stand. Instead of immediately asking, what is wrong with me? I can sometimes ask, where am I in the wave? Not as a technique, not as a productivity hack, not as a way to emotionally optimize myself into a more efficient mammal. Just an orientation. Did something open? Did something feel too much? Am I tired because I failed, or because something expanded and now the system is asking for time? Am I avoiding this because it is wrong for me, or because it is right enough to be frightening? Am I trying to force today to carry a capacity I only had yesterday in a completely different state? These are not always easy questions to answer, and I don't think the point is to answer them perfectly. The point is to pause long enough that the first cruel story is not the only story available. Because the first story is often very dramatic, especially inside Contraction. Contraction can be an extraordinary novelist. It takes one tired afternoon and writes an entire 12-part saga called Everything is Over and It Was Always Stupid. Expansion, to be fair, has its own literary problems. Expansion writes, I have solved my life and shall now begin 7 projects. Neither manuscript should necessarily be published immediately. That, I think, is one of the useful things about recognizing the cycle. Not choosing one state as the true one. Not saying expanded you is wise and contracted you is broken. Not saying contracted you is honest and expanded you is deluded. Both carry information. Both belong. But neither is the whole weather system. And maybe that is where a little maturity begins. Not in never expanding too quickly. Not in never contracting dramatically. Not in becoming so balanced that nothing ever knocks us sideways. But in learning not to hand the pen to whichever state happens to be loudest. Let expansion show the possibility. Let contraction name the caution. Let capacity tell the truth about what can be held. Let integration ask what can actually become livable. And then maybe the next step becomes a little clearer. Not the biggest step, not the most impressive step, not the step that proves you've changed forever. Just the next real step. The one that can be held, the one that keeps the wave moving. The one that does not require you to pretend you're already standing somewhere you have not yet reached. And that, I think, leads naturally into the question I keep coming back to now. How do we learn to flow with the wave without trying to force it into the shape we imagined it should take? This is the part I'm still very much learning. Very much. I do not say any of this as someone who has achieved graceful mastery over pacing, capacity, expectation, creativity, family life, rest, or indeed the general business of being alive. I say it as someone who has, over time, become slightly better at noticing when he is trying to sprint up a hill, whilst insisting he is simply enjoying a gentle walk. And that has been useful. Humbling, but useful. Because one of the patterns I've been noticing in myself is that expansion can very quickly become expectation. Something opens, an idea arrives, a new interest arrives, a possibility starts growing. And almost immediately, the mind starts building walls around it. What is this going to become? How good am I at it? Is it useful? Could it become a project? Could it be part of my identity? Should I buy equipment? Should I research for 6 hours straight? Should I compare myself to people who have been doing it professionally for 20 years and then feel strangely discouraged? Again, hypothetically. And suddenly, this little living thing that might have wanted to teach us something gets placed inside a job description. It has to justify itself, perform, become impressive, become productive, become proof that we are growing. And that can kill the aliveness very quickly. I think a lot of hobbies and creative impulses die there. Not because they were wrong, not because they had nothing to offer, but because we asked them to become too much too soon. There is one version of this where the thing never even begins. I'd love to learn guitar one day. I'd love to paint. I'd love to write. I'd love to take better photographs. I'd love to try that. Eventually, one day, when life is calmer, when I have more time, when I feel ready, when I can already be good at the thing I've not yet even started. Which is a very efficient trap. Because if you never begin, you never have to become a beginner. Then there is the complete opposite version. The expansion arrives, and we throw ourselves in so hard that the poor thing barely survives contact with our enthusiasm. We buy the guitar, the stand, the tuner, the books, the online course, the notebook, possibly a second notebook for more serious guitar thoughts. We watch tutorials, we reorganize the room, we imagine the future, we become, emotionally speaking, a guitar person. And then 3 weeks later, the whole thing lives under the stairs, beside a yoga mat, a bread maker, and several previous versions of ourselves that we no longer make eye contact with. And I say this with no judgment, only recognition. Because sometimes the healthier path is neither never beginning nor throwing ourselves in so hard that we burn out. Sometimes the healthier path is pacing, 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 pacing. That's what I've tried to drill into my mind throughout this walk. An adventure without expectation. Not what must this become, but what does this want to show me? Not, am I good enough to justify doing this? But what happens if I give this my attention for a while? That shift feels small, but to me, it changes everything. Because it turns growth back into relationship. With the project, with the body, with the season of life, with the version of you that is curious enough to begin, but not yet shaped by the experience. And that is where the phrase we found earlier feels useful to me. The next resonant edge. Not the fantasy leap, not the heroic overhaul, not the version that exists mainly because you saw someone else doing it beautifully online and briefly decided you should probably become them before the weekends. The next resonant edge. The place that feels alive and just about holdable. Familiar enough to recognize, new enough to grow. Like you, but not quite you yet. This is often where the good movement is. Not in forcing yourself into the total unknown, not in staying inside the known forever, but in that knowable bridge between the two. The breadcrumb, the small doorway, the adjacent room. For me, a lot of the healthiest expansion has worked like that. Thinking became writing. Writing slowly evolved into a podcast. Not because I woke up one morning and decided to reinvent myself completely, but because one form of attention slowly opened into another. Photography was similar. I had always liked taking pictures. Point and click. Notice something beautiful. Capture it badly. Move on. Then lockdown created a strange pocket of space. Not an easy time, not a simple time, but a different time. A time where some demands reduced, some rhythms changed, and a certain kind of capacity became available. So I went a little deeper. Learned how to use the aging manual camera I received as a gift shortly before. Learned a little about composition. Learned how editing could bring more of the image to life. Not because I needed to become a professional photographer, not because I needed to compete with people producing breathtaking work, but because the thing was there, and I was curious. And at that strange time, I had just enough capacity to meet it. That is a very different energy from forcing. It is more like letting the thing teach you what relationship it wants to have with your life. And I think that matters because comparison can crash that very quickly. There are always better artists, better writers, better musicians, better photographers, better podcasters, better parents, better people apparently living the dream in warm lighting with an immaculate kitchen and emotionally regulated children. Or at least, again, that is the version that we are shown. And if we compare our beginning to somebody else's edited middle, or our messy process to somebody else's polished outcome, we may never give the thing a chance to become ours. Because your particular niche is not usually visible before you begin. Your peculiar angle is not always available in advance. You discover it through contact, through practice, through mistakes, through repetition, through letting the thing meet you as you actually are. That means you can never know what your version of the thing might become if you never give it any attention. And you also cannot know if you strangle it immediately with expectation. That is the balance I am trying to learn. To give things enough attention to unfold, without building a wall around them made of pressure, comparison, and imagined outcomes. To let the adventure breathe. And this does not only apply to hobbies, it applies to healing, relationships, parenting, work, spiritual exploration, creative projects, the whole strange business of becoming a person over time. We often mistake now for forever. This phase is hard, so it will always be hard. This capacity is low, so it will always be low. This child needs this much support now, so life will always look exactly like this. This project is awkward now, so it will never flow. This first attempt is messy, so maybe I'm not built for the thing. But life rarely copies and pastes itself that cleanly. The next challenge may still be hard, but it will often be differently hard. It may ask for different muscles, different patience, different support, different courage. And that is easy to forget when we are inside the current wave. So perhaps learning to flow, not force, means allowing the present to be true without making it final. Yes, this is hard now. Yes, this is my capacity now. Yes, this is the edge now. But now is not forever. And the thing itself may still be becoming. I may still be becoming. The relationship between us may still be becoming. So the question becomes less, how do I make this into what I expected? And more, what is this becoming if I stop trying to trap it too early? That for me feels like a kind of adventure. Not passive, not vague, not drifting, but paced, curious, responsive, alive. The kind of adventure that lets the wave move, without demanding that it proves the whole ocean by the end of the week. And when we start seeing the wave that way in our own lives, it becomes easier to notice it everywhere else too. In relationships, in families, in collaborative projects, in communities, in whole systems trying, messily and imperfectly, to grow into shapes they do not yet know how to hold. A relationship expands when new honesty enters it. A family expands when a new need becomes visible. A project expands when it becomes more real than the fantasy version. A culture expands when a new possibility, a new freedom, a new technology, or a new way of seeing people enters the room. And then, often, something contracts. Not always because the expansion was wrong, not always because the truth should not have been spoken, not always because the possibility was false, but because the system has to reorganize around what has been revealed. The relationship has to find a new shape. The family has to adjust. The project has to meet ordinary life. The culture has to discover whether it has the language, trust, maturity, and capacity to hold what has been opened. And that is not always graceful. In fact, in my experience, it is rarely graceful. Most living systems do not expand like a beautifully choreographed dance. They expand more like someone trying to assemble flat-pack furniture while tired, emotionally invested, and quietly suspicious that an essential screw is missing. But maybe that is part of the process too. Expansion, contraction, capacity, integration, at every scale. And we'll come back to that more purposely in a future episode. Because I think this pattern has a lot to say about relationships, communities, technologies, conflict, and the very strange business of trying to build a freer world without demanding that everyone occupy the same room in the same way. But for today, I want to bring it back to the ordinary wave of a single life, because that is where most of us meet it first. The brave step followed by tiredness, the exciting idea followed by overwhelm, the breakthrough followed by doubt, the possibility followed by the old pattern tapping politely on the window. And maybe the invitation is not to panic every time that happens, not to declare the whole thing ruined, not to assume you are back where you started. Maybe the invitation is simply to ask, where am I in the wave? Is something opening? Is something contracting? Am I at capacity? Is something trying to integrate? What is the next resonant edge? Not the version of the journey that exists mainly because you looked at someone else's edited life and briefly decided you were behind. The next real edge, familiar enough to recognize, new enough to grow you. And perhaps that is enough. Not forever, not as a final answer, not as a new box with nicer wallpaper. Just enough for the next honest movement. Because the aim is not to stay expanded forever, and it is not to contract so completely that nothing new can reach you. The aim, if there is an aim, is to become a little more able to move with reality. To open when life opens, to rest when the system needs care, to respect capacity without turning it into a prison, to let integration be ordinary enough to become real. And maybe, over time, the house can hold more life. One shelf, one room, one rhythm, one conversation, one boundary, one brave little experiment, one return to center. Not because we forced ourselves into a bigger shape, but because we tended the shape we were actually in. And maybe that is what I am slowly learning. That growth does not always arrive as a straight road into a better future. Sometimes it arrives as a tide, a breath, a pulse, a return, a wave. And perhaps the wave was never the thing in the way. Perhaps the wave was the way. Thanks for listening. I've been Paul. This has been Accidental Transcendental. Stay curious, stay humble, and never stop asking why. See you next time.